In this video, I wanted to take a little bit deeper of a look into some of the scaling of IBGP that we can use and dig into some of the details of it. And I mean, we're not going to go super deep, but I need to cover at least enough information so you guys have a better understanding of how route reflection works, because it's probably going to be the most common thing that you guys see in the real world when it comes to BGP environments, assuming you're running BGP in your environment. So we use route reflectors to eliminate the need for full mesh connectivity. Again, you have a route reflector, the IBGP neighbor relationships you're going to form, you're going to tack on the route reflector client keyword on the route reflector itself, and then on the device it's going to be the client to the reflector. You simply just peer with the route reflector, and any routes that you learn are going to be reflected outbound towards or any routes you learn inbound or outbound are going to go through the reflector to get to you or to who you're advertising the routes out to. So that's going to be the general idea of how this works. So if you're familiar with the OSPF DR or the ISIS designated intermediate system, they both work the same way. You send all your updates to the DR or the DIS, and then they reflect the routes out. They do not modify the other attributes when reflecting the routes either. So whatever you get is whatever you receive in is what you get, is what you pass on. So all you're doing is reflecting the routes. You're not doing anything besides that. So the loop prevention technique that they use when it comes to route reflection is a cluster ID. The route reflector discards routes received with its own cluster ID because it already knows about them. It doesn't need to relearn them in. You can set the originator ID attribute, assess the originator attribute for the route ID of the route reflector client on routes received from the client. Client uses originator ID for loop prevention. Now, I'm going to go over a couple more details, and I'm actually going to break down what all that means, because you might be thinking, what does that mean? So, the idea behind the originator ID is going to be who originally advertised the route to the route reflector. The cluster ID is going to be the router ID of the route reflector itself. So the originator is going to be whoever advertised the route to the route reflector. So that's going to determine where the route came from. So if you're trying to do a recursion on the route, you can look at that, and it's going to tell you where the route came from. And there's a question: can you use route reflection outside of an autonomous system? Because all you keep mentioning is IBGP. No, you cannot. Route reflection is only available in IBGP relationships. So if you had a situation where you wanted to reach outside of your network, that is not possible to do with a route reflector. So, and the originator ID, if he learns it back in, if he does see that, he's going to drop it. So, now when it comes to the peerings, it's pretty simple to set up a route reflection design. So again, the route reflector is going to be a central point, is chosen for all devices in the domain, and typically on the edge. So this is going to be a router that's receiving internet routes like eBGP inbound to a default route, or whatever the case might be in your particular peering agreement with your ISP. When that does occur, then you need to make sure that you have a way of getting those routes inbound. So by default, when you learn a route in and you have your router, you're doing both eBGP and IBGP, you will not forward those routes on to other IBGP neighbors. The only way you can get around that is with either doing a full mesh of peerings or with route reflection. And the easiest way to do that is with route reflection, as you've seen. So I've set up the lab so you guys can see the amount of config that goes into setting something up, and then being able to scale that config down. Now, when it comes to the way that this is set up, assuming you've got route reflection in place, like we do, for an eBGP peer, routes learned from eBGP peers can be sent to other eBGP peers, clients, and non-clients. IBGP client peers, routes learned from client peers can be sent to eBGP peers or other client peers and non-clients. And non-client peers, routes learned from non-client peers can be sent to eBGP peers and client peers, but not other non-clients. So here's the one question that everybody keeps asking: what's a non-client? A non-client is going to be a device that does not have the association to a route reflector client capability on the route reflector itself. So you're peering with other routers that are IBGP, and those are going to be non-clients. You can still send and receive traffic, except for a non-client cannot talk to other non-clients. through the reflector anyway. So when it comes to update processing, it's pretty straightforward. The way that it breaks down is pretty simple. You have the route reflector processes updates differently depending on what type of peering it came from. So when the route reflector receives routes from its IBGP peers, they are tagged internally as being received from a client peer and are candidate to be advertised to everybody. When it comes to eBGP learned routes, they are passed to other eBGP peers, clients, and non-clients. Here I just summarized. When a route is advertised or reflected from the route reflector to a client or non-client, BGP attributes such as the next hop and a next hop value are not updated. So instead, two attributes are added into the reflected prefix: the originator ID and the cluster list. The originator ID is going to be 150.22 or 151.22, and the cluster list is going to be 150.111. The originator ID is set by the route reflector as the router ID of the neighbor from which it was learned, which it learned the prefix. If the originator ID matches their own local route, router ID, the route is discarded. The cluster list contains a cluster IDs of the route reflectors that the route transited through in the network. Unless the BGP cluster ID is manually configured under the BGP routing process, the value defaults to the router ID of the route reflector. So let's take a look at this in a bit more detail. And there's a question, can you make this any bigger? You can, and it's ironic that you said that. Typically, you can do large scale or you can do clusters, and you can have you can do clusters. Typically, like your cluster would, if you're going to do large scale route reflection, the way that this would typically work is like this. Let's say, for instance, we have, how far back can we go here? Okay, so let's say this guy right here is a route reflector, and this guy right here is a route reflector. You can, and let's assume for just a moment that this is all IBGP. Okay, one big autonomous system. Well, what you can do here is you can set up this guy to be a route reflector for these sets of routes, and you can set this guy to be a route reflector for these set of routes. Now what's going to end up happening is you can set this guy up to be a route reflector for this guy, and vice versa for this guy. The idea here is if R7 advertises a route, and then R3 advertises it back, when R3 advertises it back, R7 is going to see its own cluster list in the originator ID, and he's going to say, oh, well, I originated that route, I'm going to drop it. It's a way for you to prevent you from double learning. And going back to the original statement in here, it does talk about fate sharing with that. And fate sharing basically means you're not going to place two types of service on the same physical wire. Meaning you're not going to let your internet routing and your MPLS routing travel the same wire. Or now, I've never worked for a very large-scale service provider, so DWDM, like dense wavelength multiplexing, that type of stuff when you're dealing with fiber, I've never dealt with that stuff in production, so I honestly don't know how that would really work. But for instance, you're not going to have your MPLS service and your BGP service running over the same physical wire. You're going to have some sort of redundancy built into place where that would work. So that's typically how you would set that up, and that's generally how you would set that up. Now, just a little bit of sidebar stuff for this is more advanced level stuff for like the CCIE stuff. Some virtual route reflectors, and I have set this up once in production, where I had a company had several thousand routes that it wanted to be able to replicate, but it didn't have a box to dedicate to that. And so we were sitting there thinking about it. I said, well, you can do a CSR 1000V, and it's just going to host a control plane. And he said, well, your throughput. I said, it's not in the data plane. It doesn't need to have a high throughput. So we downloaded the CSR. We installed it into his ESXi environment. And I made sure that he could, that box could talk to the rest of the environment, which it did. We put it into its own port group in ESXi, set up to a link on an uplink that connected to a switch that was connected to another BGP router. We had him become a route reflector, and then we went in and we set up all of his neighbors in a maintenance window over the course of a week. We went in and we migrated, I think it was 300 routers. We migrated over to the CSR, and we had the CSR sitting in there. And the nice thing about the CSR, is it gives you that flexibility. You know, it's a beefy box. It can handle a lot, and it's regular iOS. Or actually, it's iOS XE. But the nice thing about it is it gives you that flexibility where it's not like GNS3 where we're emulating iOS. It's actually iOS. So that just gives you some ideas. And the other thing too is a lot of times people don't realize that when you're dealing with BGP route reflection, you're dealing with about 500,000 routes, and it's internet routes. Now, I've never worked in a very, very large-scale MPLS domain. I've worked in some sizable ones with a couple 100,000 routes, but I've never worked in a very, very large-scale VPN-v4. But you can have 20 or 20-some million, according to what I've read, million VPN-v4 routes as being route reflected. And again, you would not have the same router doing, and on the same ESXi host or on the same physical link, running both VPN-v4 and IPv4 BGP. It just doesn't make any sense. Now, from a before I get into breaking down what a confederation is, let's take a look at what route reflection looks like in the details. So let's take a look at that real quick. Okay, so on 5, we're going to take a look at how this breaks down, and so we're going to do a show IP BGP, and we got a bunch of routes in here, right? Well, what we want to do is we want to take some of these routes that we're seeing here, and we want to figure out what to do with them. So we're going to do a show IP route, and we're going to do a let's see here, which one can we pull up? Let me see here. To be honest with you, I don't think we're going to be able to do much. Oh, you know why? Nothing's showing up is because I haven't redistributed OSPF into BGP. That's why it's not showing up the way that I want to. So let's, for instance, go to router 1. We do a show IP interface brief. We have some routes in BGP in OSPF, right? We're going to go to global config. We're going to type in router BGP 12345, and we're going to type in redistribute OSPF OSPF 123, I believe it is. Yes. Redistribute OSPF 123 and hit enter. Now if we go up to 5, and so now we have all these routes in here, right? That's a good sign. So that shows us all the routes we have in here, and now what we can do is we can go and do a show IP BGP for this 100 route right here. So we'll just grab this guy right here, and we're going to go show IP BGP for this route. So here we go. So the way this breaks down is pretty simple. We have the originator is this guy, so router 1. The cluster list is router 3, so we're learning it from router 3, and it's being reflected to us. So that's one way to look at it, and that's how we're learning the route, is via router 3. So if we were to do a show IP BGP, as you can see here, 100 is being learned via router 1, and we go to router 3 and do the same thing, and we do a show IP BGP. We should be seeing the same set of routes, but if we take this guy right here, show IP BGP for this route, we're going to see it's coming from 5. So this allows us to know what's going on. Now what we could do is we could put these guys in the same cluster list, and that would allow you to do like inter-cluster peerings, and this would allow you to do things like if you had an office in Hong Kong and an office in LA, you could set up your routes associated through your iBGP peerings so that these guys wouldn't propagate routes. And the nice thing about this is, when you're dealing with this, it gives you that flexibility that you don't have to worry about learning duplicate routes and stuff like that if you don't need to. And it says right here, it's local and received from a route reflector client. So it tells you what's going on. So that gives you that idea. So now we can go to router 2, and I can jump out of here, and then we can do a show IP BGP, and we have these routes in here as well. So the 100 route is in there. It's being learned through OSPF though. So we do a show IP route. We're not going to see that as a BGP route though. We're going to see it as an OSPF route. And as you can see, our OSPF or our routing table just got a lot more complicated. So we have 2 different ways of getting off the network. We can go to 3 or 4 to get off the network, and each one is a valid solution. So if we were to do a trace route to 8.8.8.8, we're going to use both ways to get off the network. And that's the important part, to make sure you understand when you're looking at different things like that, you need to make sure you know where traffic is coming from and how it's going to be forwarded through your network. So that's the general idea of how you would want to make sure you understand that, is when you're breaking down how the routing table is forwarding, the fastest way to figure that out is to say, okay, if you have a route and you're trying to figure out where it's got to go, so in this case the 100 the /20/21 right here, if I do a show IP route for this route, show IP route, I don't know if it's going to do this, /21 is going to work, .0, it's telling us this right here, saying that it's learned via OSPF, distance of 110, metric of 20, it's an external type 2 route, and it's learned from .1 off of fast Ethernet 1/0, which you can see that right here. And it says the next hop IP address is this guy, and it's being learned from router 1 via this interface, and the traffic share count is 1. So we know where it's coming from. So if we did a trace route to this particular subnet, we know how it gets to router 1, but router 1 doesn't know what to do with that particular subnet. So it's in the routing table, we know how to get to where it needs to go, but once we get there, it dies because there's no actual destination with that IP address. So that's the important thing to remember. So that's a general breakdown of how you'd want to work with route reflection. And so from there, what we're going to do is we're going to start talking about the advertising routes, how you would get routes into BGP, and other things other than redistribute OSPF. There's the network command. You can do prefix lists and things like that, and some other capabilities that are available. So we'll talk about that coming up in the next video, and then we're going to start getting into the path selection algorithm, and then you're actually manipulating routes as we go through. So I hope this has been informative for you. I'd like to thank you for viewing.